All right. Well, welcome back for another 5 minute later episode of Rising Stars here. As always, we've got Jessica Cefa as co-host here and bringing back at our request, Sabrina Zerzouri from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island. And I don't think we've ever done an episode this close to the last one, but just the timing was too perfect here. I think that we were actually recording this episode while the proposed rule was being released. And so many of the things that we said, while very valid and still valid in a lot of ways, there are a lot of things that are very, very different than what we were evaluating last time. So we asked Sabrina to come back and join us to now look at this whiplash, this shift, that we've seen with the proposed rule. And just getting started, we always look at the numbers. What do the numbers tell us? And I think depending on what chair you're sitting in, some of these changes are going to make you very happy. Some are going to make you very sad, upset. But reward factor coming back, that's a big one. EHO4All actually never coming to life. That's another really significant one. And then surprisingly, all of these measures that are going away potentially are having a really significant impact. You look at the measures that were selected to go away, very often the highest performing ones. And I think that we saw that when we applied these changes to STARS 2026, 89% of plans saw their scores go down. A good percentage of them, actually like 50 of them, lost QBP, totaling about $1.3 billion. You only saw about 50 plans seeing their scores improve. So this is a really significant impact. The nationals, they saw 94% of their contracts saw scores decline. So really impactful as we're going through this. And, it seems like, you were talking about this earlier, Sabrina, and you did talk about this is not just change, this is a whole just reform. And, some of these changes are just so fundamental, and specifically bringing reward factor back, never letting EHO4All see the light of day. There are a lot of plans who have really banked heavily on this change and put a lot of effort into their strategy to make sure that they were optimized around getting the biggest bang from the buck as they can from EHO4All. So, question to you, is all of that lost? Was it wasted? Is there still value here? How do plans think about a kind of near-term strategic shift based on some of these changes that were just proposed?
So I will say all is not lost, right? Surprise from CMS, overall gone, right? And to your point, some plans maybe are ecstatic about this. Others were probably relying heavily on maximizing the health equity reward to get them over the threshold of a 3.5, maybe to a 4, and so on and so forth. What I will say for plans even that are pleased that the reward factor is being proposed for reinstatement is the work for health equity in particular still matters a lot. These members that were identified with SRFs or the social risk factors, LIS, dual eligible, and disabled members, they have legitimate health disparities. And it behooves all of us to create programs, initiatives, interventions, if you will, to ensure that we are addressing health disparities. Because even with the reinstatement of the legacy reward factor, for a plan that might have been teetering on their overall summary, perhaps just being on the cusp of that minimum 4-star threshold, reward factor won't really help all that much if you don't actually increase your scores, if you don't actually increase performance.
Right.
Right? I mean, it's still a reward methodology that rewards high performing plans. If you are not high performing, you will not receive a reward factor. And so all of the work around health equity, needless to say, I think the planning, the structure of programs is probably still the right move among probably other strategies that were put in place. There may have been plans that maybe designed their enrollment strategies though about bringing in perhaps members with SRFs, those plans maybe have a little bit of grief going on, and maybe want to do some analyses about whether or not this is a positive change. But outside of that, as we think from the quality improvement standpoint, the position really is that these strategies are still the right way to go.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you know what I love, Sabrina? Every strong stars leader that we bring onto this show, you included, Brendan Generali, I think of some of the other folks Mick and I have spoke with in the past, this is the consistent message, right? Lifting up the underserved, right? The lowest performing subset within each measure, whether EHO for all HEI is there or not, is the only thing, you're right, that's going to raise the measure overall and get you the reward factor that you need.
But I would say I think that you're right, because I think some of the good things that came out of the initial announcement of HEI or EHO for all was this focus on this social risk factor population. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of clung to the idea that there were going to be learnings that we all determined, like, here's how we can better serve this group. And if you're one of those plans that is more effective at figuring this out or applying these rules, you are going to see benefits. And whether EHO for all is there or not, you're going to see it in other places, like you guys have mentioned. One could be increased star ratings on this, depending on where you are. But another big one is it can very often mean the difference in QI category status on a measure by measure basis. And with these changes that are coming through, all of a sudden, instead of getting 6 points for one of your QI measure, star rating increases, you're getting like 9.25. So all of a sudden, these changes can really still benefit you, and arguably in a bigger way than potentially an EHO for all reward could have. When you think about from a number standpoint. So do you think, Sabrina, is that something that you're seeing people think about, talk about, an increased focus on those QI measures?
Definitely, especially with all of the proposed changes that are coming with potential measure removals and all of the like. I think QI metrics are becoming increasingly important and should be a pretty core fundamental part of your strategy. As we all, are in the weeds of doing our forecasting, sometimes just one gap could really make the difference and lead to a potential bump in QI. We also talked just a little bit briefly on, well, let's not forget that there is that looming proposal around the QI hold harmless provision being removed, and maybe plans actually don't have a choice anymore. And so, if it's not already a pretty core part of your strategy, it probably should be. They're 5 times weighted measures, two of them, and they're pretty
Mm-hmm.
significant. And like I had said, can make a huge difference in the overall summary score that you end up from, all of your performance. And I think not only focusing on health equity gaps can potentially make the difference in your performance overall, but really segmenting out your population and understanding your members a bit better in that regard, both with the health equity lens and perhaps more generally, can get you to that point. So definitely that is a focus, and I see it definitely as a core strategy and being able to move the needle on performance overall.
Yeah, I love that. And rethinking to some extent, when you really get into the math of the QI calculations. We had a star schema before where the vast majority of the measures were on the Part C side, and they fed into that Part C QI measure rating that held 5 weight. And then you had this really smaller subset of measures on the Part D side that fed into a Part D QI that held the same weight, right? So less effort on a smaller subset of measures for a bigger lift. But with this measure removal, I really want to, and I know you're already doing this, Mick, but just dig into to understand, how does that change the math for us, right? With the vast majority of these measures being slotted for removal coming from the Part C side of the measure schema, while in parallel we've got additional Part D measures entering, codified measures entering the STARS schema starting next calendar year, the following STAR year. What does that look like to QI? Does that level the scales a little bit between how much effort we need to put in on the pharmacy side and the Part C side?
Well, if you think about the, even on Part D, you're losing the appeals measures, you're losing complaints, you're losing the disenrollment.
Some of those, yeah.
What does this do to the overall QI calculation, and how much weight? You have much fewer measures that ultimately impact, a 10 weight, overall. And so I think you're exactly right. I think it's a fresh look at all of this and seeing where kind of the potential low-hanging fruit might be. You got a lot of these measures where the movement's just not that much to hit a significant improvement piece. And with math like this, I think you have to start looking at it in a more detailed way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was thinking too, and I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, Sabrina, where we talk about HEI, EHO4All. I feel like we have to call it by both names every time. With that methodology, never seeing the light of day, but still being the core subset of members we need to focus on to move. I mean, just to hammer that down again, it's not going away everywhere, right? Like, what's that big change happening on the Part D side? All of those triple weighted Part D measures will be risk adjusted for a very similar set of disparities that were adjusted for through the EHO4All methodology. Back to your point of all this work is not for naught, right? Isn't for naught, and it's still going to lift it up even more so on the Part D side. It's also not just useless anymore. It's still part of your STAR strategy in the math.
I really appreciate actually that you bring up the risk adjusted adherence measures, right? It's these changes proposed by CMS, I think, indicate a couple of very clear things. One, and Mick, to your earlier point with all of the data, right? X% of plans will drop a rating or lose QBP in some capacity. All of this signals a removal of gameability that CMS is trying to push for from my perspective. That's my read. Where based on the data, Mick, that you're sharing kind of indicates that, well, with the removal of these ops measures, it kind of says, well, plans were clearly relying on them to get them over the threshold, and they were depending on their high performance of maybe 4 stars and above to get them to where they need to be for a QBP earning. And Jessica, to the point of, well, health equity is still sort of the undertone here, and I think all quality professionals probably are reading into this as sort of a similar way, right? It's not going away from risk adjustment. We know that the only way to truly improve clinical programs is if we, again, understand our population's needs, and oftentimes that comes back to health disparities, SDOH variables, right? CMS had proposed adding an additional SRF of geography. What that meant as far as the definition, well, perhaps we'll never know. But either way, this is the thought track on health equity, and I think STAR leaders probably already think this way, because you cannot treat every gap the same, because no one member is the same. And I think that that's really where the health equity undertone will come in and still pretty much be a pretty core strategy of moving the needle on STAR ratings. And now, perhaps without EHO4All/HEI, plans maybe have a little bit more freedom and flexibility in the way that we're defining and thinking about health equity. We have our SRF groups that have been previously defined, but what about also pulling in race and ethnicity data, language, and making sure that we're meeting members' needs where they're at, where, again, we're being challenged to no longer be able to get over the threshold of 3.5 stars to QBP to 4. The only way we can do that is if we're truly developing clinical programs and outcomes-based programs that are customized, frankly, for members.
Yes. I love so much that you said that, Sabrina. We think of as removal of our ability to address equity, or removal of even the recognition of equity as a data point in our ability to help members achieve maximum health. But maybe, to your point, I never thought of it that way, and I really love that. Maybe removal of limiting the definition of health equity allows us, right, to address all the other disparity type variables that are keeping our members from being healthy as they could be.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we were first kind of diving into the HEI analysis, and how do you think about where you're improving? It was, it's going to be these 3 categories. If you can dive down into those categories, if you can understand where, what's driving it, is it that one aspect of one of those categories, it can open up a lot. And I, like Jessica, I hadn't really thought about it now with the removal of EHO4All, but you're right, Sabrina. If people can really just kind of keep thinking about that, but continue to dig down and not let's not limit ourselves to those three categories, but let's dig in, understand what specific portions of our membership, are being challenged here and how do we better support that. It does open up a lot of doors that can, again, be very beneficial outside of just an EHO4All reward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely, for sure. And I think too, just to even further reinforce this idea, and we chatted about this a bit, but the proposal to add a depression screening and follow-up measure, I think is once again another signal of, well, health equity isn't going away. We're actually bringing behavioral health in, which at its core, the fundamental is health equity and addressing SDOH needs of our members. We've got the HOS measure for improving or maintaining mental health. Now we're probably looking at bringing in a depression screening measure and so on and so forth. And so I think just the way, again, that we understand our membership, the way that we understand the way our processes within the plan are working. If you've got behavioral health teams, how are they interacting with members? What is your success rate? How do you measure success in the mental health space, in the behavioral health space? And what kind of health equity barriers are likely impacting members' ability to get the care that they need potentially to address these very complex issues. CMS is still thinking about that. And so health plans should be too.
That's right. I can't tell you how many. I loved our little chat. I wish it would have been recorded and part of this session prior to hitting the on switch here. But I love that you're in a health plan that prioritizes the behavioral health needs of your members. And it sounds like you didn't develop this yesterday after the proposed rule dropped. You've had these programs in place, these behavioral health partnerships in place for a while. And you guys, you've got a strong foundation to stand on to really be successful with these members as behavioral health enters stars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just one other note too, as we think about behavioral health and its role that it plays in star ratings and really quality of care too. We talked a bit too about, the shift of the program, the removal of these plan operational measures. Well, what does that mean for providers? I think we'll be having a pretty strong reliance on our relationships with providers.
Yes.
Behavioral health is a space certainly where providers play a foundational, fundamental role in ensuring that members get the care that they need, the follow up care that they need if we do find that there is a behavioral health need. And so, all of this plans should really be thinking about the structure of the provider engagement piece. Are incentives aligned where they should be? Do we have the right channels open, potentially with community partners as well as our provider partners,
Right.
to ensure that we're meeting members where they're at in many cases, which again, the undertone there is health equity. It's not going anywhere. In fact, I think the need for a really strong health equity understanding in our strategies is probably more fierce than ever with these changes.
Yeah. And taking your environment into account too. I know in some states it's very, very challenging. There's a lot of firewalls between behavioral health data on the provider side and ability to access that from the payer side. And in other states and areas that flow is a little bit easier. So I wonder if we'll see some disparities in performance or maybe even just unique challenges state to state depending on what the environment looks like.
We were talking before about just the significance of this change and, the timing of this change.
Mm-hmm.
And, what does this do to people's views on long-term strategic planning? How long is realistic for us to do strategic planning when we can see changes like this that come in, relatively at the 11th hour? Do you guys have thoughts on that you want to share?
I sure do.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and start? You're sitting in the plan right now, so would love to hear it from you.
Yes, yes, I sure do have thoughts about it. So, you know, I have two views of this. First of all, part of the reason why I absolutely love working in star ratings is because of sort of this very environment where we're constantly challenged to think about new and better ways. Perhaps better is a subjective thing, right? But new and better ways to continue
Mm-hmm.
improving the quality and care of our members. And I think that makes star ratings so important and so exciting. But then there's also this very real aspect of all of these changes have immediate impact in some cases on the way that plans think about budget, they think about the plan, and it's not feasible to just be kind of sitting in limbo year to year to year wondering, well, what's CMS going to come out with this year? And I think while that probably is the reality in some cases, there should still be the ability to create long-term plan because once again, the star ratings being kind of at the core of how we design our strategy, but isn't quality too? And quality, if you're designing a strategy with that in mind, the star rating methodological changes or nuances that are introduced to the program will always make a difference, but shouldn't completely throw you off track to where now you're feeling like you need to build from the ground up. Plans shouldn't be feeling
Mm-hmm.
like that if we're thinking about strategies that truly improve performance as far as the score on these star measures and quality overall. We know where our gaps are, and we should be able to design programs and partnerships within the community with our providers, vendors, whomever that will help us support getting kind of to the next level, if you will.
100%. And investments, even in these subset of measures that's proposed for retirement, investments in improvement in performance as measured through the current operational measure set, that's not going to stop benefiting us later, right? If we think for a minute that, and plans have to remember too, these are not things we were doing for stars. We weren't timely with appeals and fairness with appeals. Like, these are all part of our contract with CMS regardless, and we're in compliance hot water regardless if we don't meet these metrics. It was never just for stars, right? And back to how their investment will still pay out. I think if we're not timely, if we're continually denying things that should be covered, if all members are disenrolling, all of this is, maybe it won't play out directly in that star measure, but it's going to play out in CAHPS measures and in the experience measures and in the other measure sets across the board. So investments still well worth it, even if not just in the health equity space.
Yep.
Well, and I do think that's the right way to look at it. I hadn't thought about it like that. Yes, if you're investing in the right things, the rules are going to tweak things here and there. But if you're fundamentally doing the right things, you should be successful in any of these measurement type situations. And one thing that was just popping around in my head was, HOS. We were talking about the HOS, changes in weights from what we knew before, right? You're seeing that increase in weights, and then you take out a whole bunch of other measures and, the weights go up yet again. And so how are you guys seeing that in terms of where do you think, like, we're already seeing a lot more people focusing on the HOS measures. Do you think that continues to change, with this new rule?
So we did talk a bit about Haas in our last segment, and I'm excited to talk about it again because I think what we sort of had a conversation around was, well, we can't forget that this domain exists, and now CMS simply won't let us. I mean, come STAR 2029, these measures are going to equal about what, almost a fifth or so, maybe give or take a few percentage points of
Right.
our rating. But if we look at member experience as a full umbrella and we think about HOS and CAHPS together, I mean, that's 40 some odd percent of our rating with these changes in STAR 2029. So it's a significant part of, I think, the shift of the program and where we're trying to go with outcomes and member experience sort of being the core focus. And I think, once again, Jessica, to your point about, well, we designed strategies and programs about improving the way that we conduct our appeals and grievances and complaints department. And we think
Mm-hmm.
about customer service as a pretty fundamental part of the rating today. We're challenged to make sure that when members call in to ask questions or have some sort of grievance that they'd like to settle with the health plan, that we have staff and resources that are equipped to handle these potential concerns, and therefore also contributing pretty astronomically to our overall CAHPS. And I don't think that messaging changes one bit. I think it becomes so important that we begin embedding sort of, dare I say, maybe like predictive analytics into the way that we are, the way that we are thinking about our members, and being able to identify who within our membership is most at risk for a fall, or working with
Yeah.
providers to talk about topics that are potentially stigmatized, like bladder control and mental health and behavioral health issues. I think it opens up a whole new way that we can kind of go about setting our priorities, and making connections in the program where our priority just might not have been there before, simply because the weighting wasn't there. So this directional shift maybe is sort of the catalyst to do that.
Absolutely. And I don't know how you think about those outcomes measures in Haas, Mick and Sabrina, but I think of them almost too as just a measure of how effective are you at closing HEDIS gaps, managing disease states, keeping folks adherent with their medications, all the other things in the STAR schema that measure how well we are managing the health of our 65 year and older populations, right? What is that but a 2-year measure of ability to maintain physical and mental health over time?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times plans get really myopic and measure focused, right? And they look at measures in isolation, and they become measure focused, and really lose that member centricity and that member focus, where that same measure, that same member rather, if you're getting that identified historic cost data and digging into that same member that's showing a decline over a 2-year time frame, how many, look, you've got the claims data from then too, right? How many other measures did that member hit that were maybe red flags and indicators to you along that 2-year journey? How many times did they hit plan all cause readmissions? How many times did they impact transitions of care management, or follow up after EDUs for multiple chronic conditions, the diabetes measures? I mean, it could go on forever, right? How many red flags did you get along that 2-year time frame that gave you opportunity to intercede and help maintain health in a way that plays out as it's measured through Haas?
I'm going to continue to love the, dare I say, predictive modeling, predictive analytics. Like,
Right?
it's just so perfect. And you're hitting on it. And, like you guys were both talking about, the CAHPS and Haas, what I was trying to picture your LinkedIn post, Jessica, was like 47-ish%, right? Of those two together. And yeah, you think about that, with that kind of, significance on those two groups of not that many measures, are we going to see plans really differentiate themselves by the ones who become really effective at understanding predicted member behavior, based on analyzing the analytics and understanding, how to organize the members and I guess understand and anticipate and prepare for these kinds of activities? Do you think that that's going to be a big differentiator going forward?
I think it very well could be. I mean, once again, the undertone of the conversation really being, well, now, and again, we always should be prioritizing, but especially now with these proposed changes, we've got to understand our members' clinical needs. It's no longer about, once again, we can sort of make up for, say, a 2-star performance in a 1 times weighted Haas measure with 5 stars in an plan admin measure. We can't do that, right? There's no gameability to that extent. And so understanding the population is going to be 100% the way to go, whether that's bringing in predictive analytics, whether that is a combination of doing that, and also kind of leveraging unique data sources, like, say, for example, HRAs, or perhaps you have a clinical care management team
Right.
that kind of collects data on a regular basis from the members that probably have the most conditional and complex needs. That there are so many risk factors that can come from that, and I think star leaders in particular need to find a way to connect all of those dots, bring the data together, make sure that we're communicating effectively with providers, our partners, anyone who has any stake in managing our members' overall healthcare journey, what it is within their healthcare journey that can, ultimately make or break their experience with the health plan and also just with their clinical
That's right.
outcomes. So that's where my mind is. That definitely, I think the data is a huge piece of that.
Agree.
I was about to ask you both if there was anything that we hadn't touched on yet. As I was thinking about that, I realized that there's something that I think that we haven't touched on yet. So I'll hit that first. So, we always run the numbers and we look at what these changes would have done to each plan. But I'm curious, Sabrina, like, how important do you think it is, if at all, take these proposed rules, look at what it would have done to your contract? And we talked about this before, sharing these kind of details with leadership. Because again, this is another one of those big ones where regardless of performance changes, these rules are going to impact your score. And to a degree, this is just, it's coming. And so,
Right.
is there something about communication and transparency that does help inform at least awareness, if not preparation and additional strategic focus, let's just say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sabrina, why don't you talk to us about how that plays out in the culture of your organization?
Yeah, and I think from our first session, we talked a bit about, well, what does it mean, with all of these changes that could potentially come into the program. My role as a star leader really is to ensure that everyone in the organization, in particular leadership, understands what that means for us at the highest level and then the trickle down impacts as well. I think part of that is definitely doing some modeling. It would not be wise to
Yeah.
totally ignore that we have access to templates from CMS that can make some of these modelings a little bit straightforward and simple. You can do some plug and chug, and I think it's always important to lead with the caveat of, well, first of all, none of this is codified, number one. Two, the weightings
Mhm.
and whatnot are all subject to change, and cut points are subject to change. And as long as you lead with all of these caveats and say, based on the information we know today, this is what it could mean for us. And here's my recommendations, or here are our recommendations as a team of what we need to do and the investments we need to make within the organization to ensure that we either maintain, if you're happy with your performance, or improve performance. I think that that's probably the most effective way to speak to leadership and numbers talk. And I think the STAR program is really
Yes.
complex. And it's not fair to assume that everyone understands the nuances that both are in this rule and also lingering around some other potential headwinds that could come into play. The number really helps to connect all of those dots to say this is what it could mean. And I think to be
That's
as
right.
you can't boil all of these proposed changes into a couple of slides and have it really translate to what the true impact is. I mean, you just can't. We've been talking for about a half hour about them, and I still feel like there's probably so much more we could get into. And so I think if you've got to bring it to the level of your leadership, you need to just have a what if scenario prepared and your strategy to be able to ensure that, again, we're not building from the bottom up. We have some things that we need to adjust, and this is how we can do it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you brought that financial picture in too. I think a lot of times quality and clinical leaders are hesitant to do that because it just feels like it goes against their nature a bit. But at the end of the day, those dollars per CMS have to be reinvested back into the member in the form of benefits that improve health and in form of reduced premiums that allow them to afford the care they need. So I love that. I think in that space too, without venturing too far out of the section of the proposed rule that's discussing star ratings changes for that financial picture, it's even more important that you take some time, if you haven't, to read through some of those risk adjustment proposals, the changes CMS has proposed on that side. We've always, as leaders, promoted communication between risk adjustment and quality, right? Just because we're talking to the same members, pulling data out of the same charts, right? We're braiding the same folks. Like let's get coordinated from that perspective. But I think from a financial perspective, a lot of when CMS replaced the reward factor with EHO4All, the prior administration, it changed the winners and the strugglers in the star ratings program, right? Those that were winners now became strugglers, and those who were strugglers looks like they might have a chance to kind of a leg up, right? If you look at those, and now it's kind of gone back this way again, but I would encourage those folks who felt that the shift back were like, oh, now I'm on the struggle bus again. take a look at some of those risk adjustment proposals, because CMS is trying, it appears through this proposed rule, to level set the funding streams coming in through risk adjustment, and to kind of allow the smaller, they call it right out, the smaller local, more regional plans a leg up by expanding what's included in that risk adjustment logic. So won't get too into that. We're not here to talk about that today, but do take the time to educate yourself on the full financial picture, and come to leadership with that as well.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that now you're introducing a part three
Part
that
three.
we're going to want to touch on. But, I just think, this proposed rule was incredibly interesting, even just from a spectator side, looking at these impacts and the changes. And, again, just like last time, I think this has been a fantastic conversation touching on a lot of it. Sabrina, is there anything that you think we ought to touch on that we haven't hit yet?
I think we covered many of the bases, and really, my general takeaway here is that this is a sign from CMS that plans definitely need to really strengthen our clinical strategies, our member engagement, provider engagement, and member experience overall strategies. And so I think more to come probably from CMS with some proposed changes. Who knows? We'll all be very excited to read the final rule, but I'm excited. This is what keeps star ratings really interesting, and while not all of these proposals may lead to higher ratings, I think fundamentally it changes the way we at least conduct business and the way that we think about quality. So appreciate the conversation today.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with every word you said there. A tiny other little tip for things outside of the stars section. Folks might want to go in and just get familiar with the proposed additional new special enrollment period that CMS is offering to members whose doctors leave the network, particularly in a time frame where we have a lot of providers choosing to pull out of MA plan networks. CMS is proposing taking that down to the individual provider level, and we know members follow their doctors, and we know a lot of stars is dependent on value-based contracts. So just, again, that's at episode 3, won't go too far, but do take some time to understand that as well as you're digging through those 460 some odd pages.
Okay, and so one final thing. I'm going to ask a question to both of you before we wrap, and this is put you on the spot a little bit. So, a lot of people have been talking about, now with some of these changes, are they going to now finally bring back this hold harmless QI change? So, today you're held harmless if your QI rating or scores hurt your overall rating if you're above 4 stars. And they're talking about moving that to 5. So now with all this, what is your sense, maybe percentage chance that happens, say, in the next year?
Oh gosh.
Who wants to go first? You want to go first, Sabrina?
I'll go first. I think as far as it pertains to calendar year 27, I don't think we'll see that introduced. I think that many of the changes put forward are pretty big game changers, and I'd like to think perhaps CMS won't. This is a bet, right? Maybe we could have a LinkedIn poll or something to see what other folks are thinking. But that's my bet. Perhaps my opinion will change in the new year, but this is what I'm thinking. If I were to tie a percent to it, I'd say there's probably only about a 30% chance that we see that in the final rule.
Yeah.
Jessica?
I would put it just a little bit lower, but I'm in the same line of thinking as you, Sabrina. I think it's definitely a financial lever to pull that CMS is keeping in their back pocket. No question. They always, with every time they put out these proposed rules with all these changes, there's a financial section that says, and we estimate it's going to save us X billion dollars over this many years, right? I think they may take some time to allow that to play out. And if it doesn't play out the way that they need it to, I think it's game on, Mick.
Yeah, the opportunity is there.
That's right.
It would pull this trigger. Well, I want to thank you guys both again for another truly fantastic discussion. And I do see a part 3 coming in some form or fashion on this stuff. Always a pleasure.
So fun. Thanks so much, Sabrina. So great to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you both so much. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.